I woke up that Saturday morning expecting nothing more than a peaceful day with a few home chores and some football in the afternoon. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside. My wife, Grace, was already downstairs, her voice carrying up as she hummed along to the radio while preparing breakfast. It was a picture-perfect start to a normal weekend, or so I thought. By the time I joined her in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pancakes filled the air. She greeted me with her usual warm smile, one that had been the cornerstone of our decade-long marriage. Life wasn't perfect, but Grace and I had built something solid, or at least that's what I believed. The day unfolded lazily, the way weekends often do. I mowed the lawn, Grace worked on her gardening, and by early afternoon, we were both sprawled on the couch, flipping through TV channels. Just as I was debating whether to start prepping the grill for dinner, the sound of a car sputtering to a halt outside caught my attention. I glanced out the window to see an old sedan parked awkwardly by the curb in front of our house. Smoke puffed from under the hood, and the driver, a man I didn't recognize, stepped out, looking visibly flustered. Grace appeared beside me, peering out with an unusual expression that I couldn't quite place. "Who's that?" I asked. "I have no idea," she replied quickly, too quickly. The man glanced around as if searching for something or someone. Grace shifted uneasily beside me, her fingers gripping the edge of her blouse. "Maybe he needs help," she suggested, already moving toward the door. I followed her, more out of curiosity than concern. By the time I reached the front porch, Grace was already outside, calling out to the man. He turned toward her, and for a split second, something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Relief? Couldn't be sure. But what struck me was the way Grace hesitated, her usual confidence replaced by a strange awkwardness. "Car trouble?" I asked, stepping in. The man nodded, his face flushed. "Yeah, sorry to bother you folks. It just broke down, won't start." I offered to help, and the three of us pushed the car into our driveway to get it out of the road. As we worked, I noticed the man glancing at Grace repeatedly, though she seemed determined to avoid his gaze. Once the car was parked, I offered to take a look under the hood, but he quickly declined. No, I'll call for a tow," he said, waving me off. I shrugged it off, figuring it wasn't my problem. Grace suggested he wait inside until help arrived, which seemed polite enough. But something about the way she said it made me feel off. There was an underlying tension I couldn't put my finger on. As the man stepped into our home, a faint unease settled over me, like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. I didn't know it then, but that moment marked the beginning of a revelation that would shatter the world I thought I knew. I had no idea who that man was, or why he was really here, but I was about to find out. The man introduced himself as Sam, and thanked us profusely for letting him stay inside while he waited for the tow truck. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something about his presence that didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way his eyes flicked toward Grace every so often, or how she seemed overly accommodating, offering coffee, snacks, anything to make him comfortable. "So, where were you headed?" I asked casually, trying to make conversation while masking my curiosity. "Just passing through," Sam replied, his voice steady but guarded. He didn't elaborate, which struck me as odd. Most people would offer a little more context, family visit, work trip, something. But not Sam. He sipped his coffee and looked out the window like he had something on his mind. Grace hovered near the counter, nervously wiping non-existent crumbs. She was usually so composed, but now she seemed jittery. It was subtle, fidgeting with her hair, avoiding eye contact with me, but noticeable enough to set off alarm bells in my head. "So, Sam," I pressed, leaning back in my chair, "what brings you this way?" Kind of an out-of-the-way neighborhood for a shortcut. Sam hesitated, glancing briefly at Grace. "Just exploring, I guess. Got lost and then this happened." He gestured vaguely toward the driveway. His answer didn't feel entirely honest, but I let it slide for now. Grace cleared her throat. "I'll go check if the tow company's called back," she said abruptly, grabbing her phone and stepping into the other room. Her departure left me alone with Sam, which only made the air between us feel heavier. "You two been here long?" Sam asked, his tone casual but his eyes too calculating for my liking. "About 8 years," I replied, studying him closely. "Why?" "No reason," he said, flashing a quick smile. "Nice place." There was an awkward silence before Grace reappeared, phone in hand. "Tow truck will be here in about 20 minutes, she announced, her voice too bright. "They'll call when they're close." "Thanks," Sam said, his gaze lingering on her a fraction too long. Grace looked away, busying herself by tidying the coffee table. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a conversation happening here, one I wasn't privy to. "So, where are you from, Sam?" I asked, determined to keep things moving. "You local or?" "Not too far," he said vaguely. "Just a couple towns over." Again, his answers felt like they were designed to keep me from asking too much. If anything, they only made me more suspicious. As the minutes ticked by, I noticed Grace checking her watch more than usual. Was she anxious for the tow truck to arrive, or for Sam to leave? The uneasy tension in the room was starting to wear on me, and I decided to break it. "Well, Sam," I said, standing up, "why don't we take another look at your car while we wait? Maybe I can figure out what's wrong." Sam opened his mouth to protest, but Grace cut him off. "That's a great idea," she said, a little too enthusiastically. "You've always been good with cars, honey." "Guess I'll grab my tools," I said, heading for the garage. As I rummaged through my tool chest, I caught snippets of a hushed conversation from the kitchen. Grace's voice was soft, almost pleading, while Sam's tone was lower, more assertive. I couldn't make out the words, but my gut told me they weren't discussing car trouble. When I returned with my toolbox, they both snapped to attention like kids caught sneaking candy before dinner. Grace quickly busied herself washing dishes, while Sam stood awkwardly by the door. "Let's see what we've got," I said, leading him outside. Under the hood, I pretended to inspect the engine while keeping an eye on Sam. He hovered nearby, his posture tense, like he was waiting for something or someone. But what struck me most was the way his gaze kept darting toward the house, as if he were worried about what or who was inside. I didn't know what game was being played here, but I was determined to find out. And as I worked, an idea began forming in the back of my mind. I decided to set my own pieces in motion. This wasn't just a random visitor with bad luck. This was something else entirely. As Sam hovered behind me, pretending to be interested in my tinkering under the hood, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his silence. It wasn't just the silence of someone awkwardly waiting. It was the silence of someone who didn't want to be here. Every now and then, his gaze flicked toward the house, and each time, his expression darkened slightly. "So, looks like you've got some coolant leaking here," I said, pointing at a spot that might as well have been random. I was no mechanic, but I knew enough to stall the situation. "Probably why your engine overheated." Sam grunted non-committally, not even bothering to look where I was pointing. His disinterest told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't here for the car. A few minutes later, the tow truck finally arrived. Sam was out of the house and halfway to the driver before I could even step out of the driveway. Grace stayed inside, peering through the blinds as if she were afraid to come out. The tow truck driver loaded the car with practiced ease, and Sam turned to me one last time. "Thanks for letting me wait here," he said, his words stiff and formal. "I appreciate it." "No problem," I replied, studying him closely. "Hope everything works out." Sam nodded, but as he climbed into the tow truck, he cast one final glance toward the house. It wasn't a casual look. It was pointed, deliberate. I followed his gaze back to the window where Grace had been standing, but she was gone now. The blinds were still swaying, though, betraying her presence just moments earlier. When the tow truck pulled away, I stood there for a while, watching the retreating taillights. Something about the whole exchange gnawed at me, like an itch I couldn't reach. And when I went back inside, Grace was waiting in the kitchen, her expression carefully neutral. "Well, that's taken care of," she said brightly, but her voice was too chipper, her smile too tight. What a strange coincidence, huh? Yeah, I said slowly, not buying her act for a second. Strange. I watched her closely, waiting for her to say more, but she didn't. Instead, she busied herself wiping down the counters. Counters that didn't need wiping. Her movements were jerky, as if she were trying too hard to seem casual. So, how'd he end up here, anyway? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. Grace froze for just a fraction of a second, so quick I almost missed it. Almost. I guess he must have gotten lost, she said, shrugging. I didn't really ask. You seemed pretty eager to help him, though. She glanced at me sharply, her smile faltering. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said, holding her gaze. Just an observation. The air between us grew thick, and for a moment, I thought she might come clean about whatever was going on. But then she plastered on that tight smile again and turned back to the counter. I'm going to take a shower, she said abruptly. Dinner will be ready in an hour. I nodded, watching her retreat upstairs. As soon as I heard the water running, I grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. I hated the idea of snooping, but I needed answers, and I needed them now. Unlocking her phone was easy. I knew her passcode. It was the same one we used for almost everything. What wasn't easy was what I found when I opened her messages. The most recent text thread wasn't from a coworker or a friend. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The messages were brief, cryptic. Be there in 15. Play it cool. Can't believe he's home. Fix it. My heart pounded as I scrolled further up the thread. The messages were littered with phrases that sent a chill down my spine. Miss you. Can't wait for next time. He doesn't suspect a thing. I didn't need a name to know who the messages were from. Sam. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Grace had lied to me. She'd been hiding something big. And now I had proof. The sound of the shower shutting off jolted me back to reality. Quickly, I put the phone back where I'd found it and sat down at the table, trying to act normal. My pulse was racing, my thoughts a tangled mess. What the hell was I supposed to do now? I sat at the dining table, pretending to review emails on my laptop, but my mind was spinning. The weight of what I'd just discovered was suffocating. I could still feel the heat of Grace's phone in my hand, the incriminating messages branded into my memory. The sound of her footsteps descending the stairs jolted me back to the present. I forced myself to look up, plastering on a neutral expression. She was dressed in her usual post-shower attire, an oversized sweatshirt and leggings, but to me she might as well have been wearing a mask. Who was this woman I had spent over a decade with? Did I even know her at all? Smells good, I said, nodding toward the kitchen where she'd started prepping dinner. Chicken Alfredo, she replied, her voice too light, too casual. Your favorite. I watched as she moved around the kitchen, her back to me. For the first time in years, I studied her, really studied her. The way her shoulders tensed ever so slightly. The way she avoided meeting my eyes for too long. She was nervous, though she was doing her best to hide it. What was that guy's deal, anyway? I asked, keeping my tone conversational. Seemed a little off. Grace paused for half a beat before answering, her hands busy chopping parsley. I didn't really talk to him much, she said, her tone carefully measured. I was just trying to be polite. Huh, I said, leaning back in my chair. Funny. He seemed awfully familiar with you. She froze mid-chop, her knife hovering over the cutting board. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said, shrugging. Just an observation. Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. You're reading too much into it, she said, her voice strained. It was just a random guy with car trouble. I wanted to press her, to demand the truth right then and there, but I held back. If I accused her outright, she'd deny it, or worse, deflect. No, I needed more. More evidence, more certainty, more control. The rest of the evening passed in a tense silence, punctuated by forced small talk. Grace seemed to sense that something was off, but she didn't ask. Maybe she thought she'd successfully thrown me off the scent. Maybe she didn't care. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the lights were dimmed, We climbed into bed. Grace fell asleep quickly, her breathing evening out within minutes. I, on the other hand, lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the day's events over and over, analyzing every detail. The cryptic texts, Sam's arrival, Grace's uncharacteristic behavior. It all pointed to one conclusion. But why? How? And for how long? At some point in the night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Grace, not yet. If she was lying to me, if she was hiding something, then I needed to uncover the whole truth. Not just for my sake, but for hers too. Whatever this was, it was bigger than me. Bigger than us. The next morning, I woke up early, slipping out of bed while Grace was still asleep. Downstairs, I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, my mind already plotting my next move. If Grace thought she could keep secrets from me, she was about to learn otherwise. It was time to play detective, and I was just getting started. The morning air was cool as I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards upstairs. Grace was still asleep, and I planned to keep it that way for a while. I grabbed my laptop and opened a private browsing window. If I was going to get to the bottom of this, I needed more than suspicions and cryptic text messages. I needed hard evidence. My first stop was our shared phone plan account. Grace had no reason to suspect I'd ever check it, which made it the perfect place to start. Sure enough, Sam's number showed up repeatedly. Late at night, during her lunch breaks, even while I was home and she was supposedly out running errands. The sheer volume of calls and texts between them made my stomach turn. But it wasn't enough to prove anything yet. I needed more. I moved on to my next step, accessing Grace's phone remotely. I'd installed a family locator app on both our phones years ago, back when the kids were little. It allowed us to track each other's locations in case of emergencies, or, as it turned out, infidelity. I checked her recent locations and noticed something odd. For the past few weeks, she'd been visiting a small motel on the edge of town. It wasn't a place we'd ever been, and it certainly wasn't the kind of establishment you'd associate with a business lunch. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I still wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. If she was going to lie to my face, I needed to make sure I had every detail locked down. I decided it was time to bring in some reinforcements. I pulled up a search engine and typed in private investigator near me. Within minutes, I had a short list of candidates. One stood out. David Kramer, a former police detective turned PI who specialized in domestic cases. His reviews were stellar, and he offered discreet surveillance services. Perfect. By the time Grace came downstairs, yawning and stretching, I'd already sent an inquiry to Kramer and was halfway through my second cup of coffee. I greeted her with a smile, pretending everything was fine. "Morning," she said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I replied. "Thought I'd get a jump on the day." She poured herself a cup of coffee and joined me at the table, her eyes scanning my face. "You okay? You seem distracted." "Work stuff," I lied smoothly. "Budget deadlines are coming up." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "Anything I can do to help?" I forced a smile. "Just keep being you." If only she knew what I meant by that. Later that day, I got a call back from David Kramer. I stepped out into the backyard to take it, keeping my voice low. "You're looking to confirm suspicions about your wife?" Kramer asked, cutting straight to the point. "Yeah," I said, feeling a lump form in my throat. Saying it out loud made it all feel more real. "There's been some suspicious activity. I need to know if there's something going on." Kramer's voice was calm, professional. "I'll need some basic details, names, routines, any patterns you've noticed. From there, I can start surveillance. If there's anything to find, we'll find it." I filled him in on what I knew, the texts, the phone calls, the trips to the motel. He took notes, asking the occasional question but mostly letting me talk. "Give me a few days," he said when I was done. "I'll be in touch as soon as I have something." After hanging up, I stood in the yard for a long time, staring at the horizon. The weight of what I was doing settled heavily on my shoulders, but I reminded myself that this was necessary. If Grace was hiding something, I needed to know the truth. And if she wasn't, well, I needed to put this paranoia to rest once and for all. By the time evening rolled around, I felt like I'd lived a week in a single day. Grace seemed her usual self, chatty, affectionate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all an act. Every laugh, every smile felt calculated, designed to maintain the facade. I played along, pretending nothing was amiss. But inside, I was counting the hours until Kramer got back to me. The truth was coming. And one way or another, everything was about to change. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception, on both our parts. Grace continued her routine, oblivious to the fact that I was now scrutinizing her every move. I, in turn, played the role of the unsuspecting husband, all the while coordinating with David Kramer, the private investigator. Kramer was efficient. Within 48 hours, he provided me with a preliminary report. Grace had met with Sam twice since the initial encounter, both times at the same motel on the outskirts of town. The evidence was damning. Timestamps, photographs, even a short video clip of them entering a room together. There was no longer any doubt. Grace was having an affair. Armed with this knowledge, I knew the time had come to confront her. But I wanted to do it in a way that left no room for denial or manipulation. I needed her to face the truth head-on. That evening, I suggested we have dinner at her favorite restaurant, a quaint Italian place downtown. She seemed pleasantly surprised, perhaps interpreting it as a sign that everything was normal. Little did she know it was the calm before the storm. Over appetizers, we made small talk. I could see her relaxing, the tension she'd been carrying seemingly melting away. It was almost enough to make me doubt my plan. Almost. As the main course arrived, I decided it was time. Grace, I began, keeping my tone steady. There's something we need to talk about. She looked up, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. What is it? I know about you and Sam. Her fork clattered onto her plate, eyes widening in shock. What are you talking about? Don't, I said sharply, more forcefully than I intended. Taking a deep breath, I continued, I've seen the messages. I've seen the photos. I know about the motel. She stared at me, mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Finally, she whispered, How did you? It doesn't matter how, I replied, feeling a surge of anger. What matters is why. Why, Grace? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I don't know, she stammered. It just happened. That's not good enough, I said, my voice rising. We've been married for over a decade. We have a life together. And you throw it away for what? A fling? It wasn't like that, she protested, finally looking at me. I never meant to hurt you. But you did? I shot back. You betrayed me. You lied to me. And for what? She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. The sight of her tears stirred a confusing mix of anger and pity within me. Part of me wanted to reach out to comfort her. But another part recoiled, remembering the images Kramer had shown me. I'm sorry, she kept repeating. I'm so sorry. I let her cry, saying nothing. There was nothing left to say. The trust between us had been shattered, and no amount of apologies could piece it back together. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up, eyes red and swollen. What happens now? I don't know, I admitted, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. But I do know one thing, we can't go back to the way things were. She nodded miserably, wiping her tears. I understand. We finished the meal in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between us. As we left the restaurant, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of loss, not just for the marriage we once had, but for the future we'd planned together. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with painful conversations and hard decisions. But for now, I was content to let the silence envelop us, a temporary respite from the storm that had upended our lives. The days following that dinner were surreal. Grace and I coexisted in a strange limbo, both aware that the foundation of our marriage had cracked wide open, but unsure how to proceed. She stayed out of my way, giving me space, while I tried to process the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume me. Anger, betrayal, sadness, confusion. I avoided talking to her directly, not because I wanted to ignore the issue, but because I wasn't ready to hear more of her excuses. But life doesn't stop for personal chaos, and I still had work, bills, and the routines of daily life to deal with. The house was quiet, too quiet, when I got home one evening. I set my briefcase down and walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Grace at the counter. Instead, I found a note taped to the refrigerator. "We need to talk. Please meet me in the living room when you're ready. Grace." Her handwriting was shaky, as if she'd hesitated before writing each word. I stared at the note for a long moment, the weight of what was coming pressing down on me like a lead blanket. Finally, I made my way to the living room. Grace was sitting on the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up when I entered, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "Thanks for coming," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my house," I replied flatly, unable to stop the bitterness from creeping into my tone. She flinched but didn't argue. "I know you're angry," she began. "You have every right to be. But I owe you an explanation." I folded my arms and leaned against the doorframe, keeping my distance. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't even know where to start. It's not like I planned for this to happen. Sam and I—" Her voice broke, and she wiped at her eyes. "It started out innocent, just friendly conversations. But somewhere along the way, it crossed a line." "Why?" I demanded, my voice sharp. "What did I do or not do that made you look elsewhere?" "It wasn't about you," she said quickly, shaking her head. "You've always been a good husband. A great one, actually. It was about me. I felt invisible, like I'd lost who I was outside of being your wife." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to dismiss them, to accuse her of deflecting blame. But deep down, I couldn't deny that there was some truth to what she was saying. Over the years, we'd fallen into a routine, comfortable but stagnant. Maybe I hadn't noticed her drifting because I was too focused on my own life to see it. "That's not an excuse," I said finally. "If you were unhappy, you should have talked to me, not him." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I should have. But by the time I realized how far things had gone, it felt too late. And then he wouldn't let it go." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated, her gaze darting to the floor. "Sam, he's not who you think he is. At first he seemed charming, supportive. But over time he started pressuring me, threatening me. He said if I didn't keep seeing him, he'd come to you, tell you everything." The anger that had been simmering inside me began to boil over. "So what? You just let him blackmail you into continuing the affair?" "I was scared," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could handle it, that I could make it stop without you ever finding out. But I was wrong. And I hate myself for what I've done." Her words left me reeling. Was she telling the truth? Or was this just another attempt to manipulate the narrative? Either way, it didn't change the fact that she'd betrayed me. But now, it seemed there was another layer to this mess. One I hadn't seen coming. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You should have told me the moment he threatened you. Instead, you let this go on for— How long, Grace? How long has this been happening?" 6 months, she whispered, her voice barely audible. 6 months. Half a year of lies, deceit, and betrayal. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. "I need time to think," I said, my voice cold and distant. "And I need the whole truth, Grace. No more lies, no more omissions. If you want any chance of fixing this, you'll tell me everything." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You have my word." I wasn't sure if I could trust it anymore, but for now it was all I had. After our conversation, I barely slept. Grace's tears, her confession, and her excuses replayed in my mind on a loop. 6 months. 6 months of sneaking around, lies, and now the revelation that Sam had been threatening her? The betrayal was a twisting knife in my gut. But now there was a second layer. Anger at him. Whether she was complicit or a victim of manipulation, I couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. I needed to confront Sam. I called David Kramer the next morning. "He's been threatening her," I said, pacing the living room while Grace was upstairs. "I need you to dig deeper into this guy. Find out who he really is." Kramer didn't miss a beat. "Got it. I'll pull his records. Look into any other cases of coercion or blackmail. We'll see if there's a pattern." "And if there is?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "We'll handle it," Kramer said. "If he's done this before, there's a good chance he's left a trail. And if he's threatening her, he's not just messing with your wife, he's messing with you. Let me handle the legal angles. But keep your cool." I nodded, though Kramer couldn't see me. Cool was not how I felt. "I want to know everything as soon as you find it." "Give me a couple of days," Kramer replied. "We'll get to the bottom of this." The waiting was excruciating. Grace walked on eggshells around me, careful not to provoke my temper, while I kept my distance, burying myself in work and avoiding her whenever I could. I didn't trust myself to stay calm if we talked again too soon. But one evening, Kramer called with an update. "Your instincts were right," he said. "Sam's real name is Samuel Carver. He has a history of preying on married women, always the same pattern. He gets involved, establishes emotional leverage, and then starts extorting them. He's been sued twice, though both cases were settled out of court. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more victims who never came forward." The rage that bubbled in my chest was almost overwhelming. "So, he's a predator." "Exactly," Kramer said. "And he's smart. He knows how to stay just inside the law. But if we can gather enough evidence, we might be able to expose him, or at least scare him into backing off." I nodded, already formulating a plan in my head. "What do you suggest?" "Set a trap," Kramer said. "Get him on record admitting to the threats. If he's pressuring Grace, he'll slip up eventually. All we need is one mistake." That night, I laid out the plan to Grace. She was hesitant at first, her fear of Sam outweighing her guilt over what she'd done. But I was firm. "If you want to fix this," I said, staring her down, "you'll do this. I can't help you if you don't meet me halfway." She swallowed hard, then nodded. "Okay, what do I need to do?" "We're going to record him," I said. "Next time he calls or texts, agree to meet him. Play along. Let him think you're still under his thumb. And then we get him to incriminate himself." Her face went pale. "You want me to meet him?" "You won't be alone," I assured her. "Kramer will be nearby and so will I. But this is the only way to end this." After a long silence, she nodded again. "I'll do it." The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A text from Sam appeared on Grace's phone the following evening. "I need to see you. Usual place, tomorrow at 4. Grace showed me the message, her hands trembling. "What do I say?" "Tell him you'll be there," I said, keeping my voice calm. "We'll handle the rest." The next day, Kramer and I parked in an unmarked van a block away from the motel. Grace went in alone, a small recording device hidden in her purse. My stomach churned as I watched her walk through the doors, knowing the danger she might be walking into. Inside, Sam greeted her with a smirk. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." Grace played her part perfectly, sitting down and letting him talk. "I'm here," she said softly. "What do you want?" "What I always want," he said, leaning closer. "You, and your cooperation. Unless you want your husband to find out every little detail." I clenched my fists as I listened through the live feed Kramer had set up. Grace's voice wavered, but she held her ground. "You said you'd leave me alone after this." Sam laughed. "Leave you alone? Not when I've got such a good thing going." That was it. The damning sentence we needed. I motioned to Kramer, who signaled his team. Moments later, they stormed the room, catching Sam completely off guard. He tried to bolt, but they blocked his exit. Grace stood frozen, her face pale as the team secured him. Sam's cocky demeanor vanished as he realized he'd been caught. As they led him away, I stepped into the room, locking eyes with him. "You messed with the wrong family," I said coldly. Grace looked at me, her expression a mixture of relief and regret. We'd stopped Sam, but there was still so much to untangle between us. The battle with him was over, but ours was just beginning. With Sam now in custody and enough evidence gathered to ensure he wouldn't worm his way out easily, you'd think I'd feel some kind of relief. And I did, just not the kind I'd hoped for. The weight of his threats was gone, but the damage he'd left behind still lingered. Grace and I returned home that night in silence, the air between us thick with unresolved tension. She broke the silence first, her voice small. "Thank you for handling that." I didn't respond right away. My mind was too cluttered, flipping between memories of her betrayal and the fear I'd felt for her safety. Finally, I said, "You shouldn't have let it get that far." "I know," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. For all of it. For him. For the lies. For everything." I stopped walking and turned to face her. "Grace, sorry doesn't fix this. I'm not even sure anything can." Her face crumpled, tears welling up again. "I know," she repeated. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Please, Jack. Just tell me what I can do." I wanted to yell, to tell her it wasn't that simple. But the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me still loved her. How could I not after all these years? But another part of me wondered if that love was enough to overcome what she'd done. Could I ever trust her again? "Give me time," I said finally. "I can't make any promises, but I need space to figure this out." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'll give you as much time as you need." The days that followed were strange and quiet. Grace moved into the guest bedroom without my asking, and we barely spoke except to coordinate meals or household matters. She left me notes occasionally, heartfelt apologies scribbled on scraps of paper, but I didn't reply. I wasn't ready. Kramer, ever efficient, updated me on the legal proceedings. Sam was facing charges for harassment, blackmail, and a host of other offenses tied to his previous victims. His trail of destruction was finally catching up to him, and though I felt a grim satisfaction knowing he'd be held accountable, it didn't erase the lingering pain at home. At work, I found myself distracted, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Grace. The good times, the laughter, the small moments that had once felt so solid. I wondered how much of it had been real, how much had been a lie. The uncertainty gnawed at me. One evening, a week after Sam's arrest, Grace knocked on the door of my office. She stood there hesitantly, holding a manila envelope. "What's that?" I asked, not looking up from my laptop. "It's everything," she said, stepping inside. "The texts, emails, everything he ever sent me. I thought you should have it. Full transparency." I took the envelope but didn't open it right away. "Why now?" "Because I want you to know I'm not hiding anything anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I broke your trust, but I'm trying to earn it back, even if it takes the rest of my life." Her words hung in the air long after she left. I stared at the envelope, debating whether to open it. Did I want to see the full extent of what had happened, or was it better to let it lie? Eventually, I slid the envelope into my desk drawer, unopened. Not because I didn't care, but because I realized the details didn't matter. I already knew enough to understand the depth of her betrayal. Reading more wouldn't change anything. It would only deepen the wound. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I found myself thinking about forgiveness. Was it even possible after something like this? And if it was, did I want to give it? Grace had made mistakes, massive, heartbreaking ones. But she'd also shown genuine remorse and a willingness to change. Was that enough to rebuild what we'd lost? I didn't have an answer yet. But as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Maybe we weren't finished after all. 2 weeks after Sam's arrest, the house was still eerily quiet, but the chaos inside my head had begun to settle. I'd spent countless sleepless nights replaying every moment of the past few months, trying to piece together not just what had happened, but why. Grace and I weren't the same couple we'd been when we got married, but I had to confront a difficult question. Was that a reason to end it all? Or was it a reason to try again? One evening, after finishing dinner separately as we had been for days, I knocked on the door of the guest room. Grace's muffled, "Come in," sounded tentative, as though she'd been bracing for this moment but wasn't sure what it would bring. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red from what I guessed were fresh tears. She looked up at me, her face etched with worry. "Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's on your mind?" I sat down in the chair across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "I've been thinking," I began, "about us, about what happened, and about where we go from here." Her breath hitched, and she nodded, waiting for me to continue. "I'm still angry," I admitted. "I'm hurt, and I don't know when, or if, that's going to go away. What you did broke something in me that I didn't think could be broken. But," I paused, choosing my words carefully, "I also know that the person who made those mistakes is sitting here now, asking for a second chance. And I can see you're serious about wanting to fix this." "I am," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I'll do anything, Jack. Anything." "Then here's what I need," I said. "Counseling for both of us. Total honesty from this point forward. No more secrets. No more lies. If we're going to try to rebuild this, it has to be on a foundation of trust." Grace nodded fervently, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do it, whatever it takes." "I'm not promising this will work," I added. "There's a lot we need to work through, and it won't happen overnight. But if you're willing to put in the effort, then so am I." She let out a shaky breath, relief mingling with her tears. "I'll prove it to you, Jack. Every day, I'll prove it." The next week, we started counseling. It was awkward at first, talking about our deepest wounds in front of a stranger, but the therapist guided us gently, helping us unpack the layers of hurt and betrayal. Grace opened up about the loneliness she'd felt, the mistakes she'd made, and her determination to make things right. I shared my anger, my doubts, and my fears about moving forward. It wasn't easy, but slowly, we began to find common ground. We started communicating more openly, addressing issues we'd ignored for years. I began to see Grace not just as the woman who had hurt me, but as someone who was flawed and struggling, just like me. One evening, months later, I came home to find Grace sitting on the porch, a soft smile on her face. She held out a glass of wine as I sat beside her, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the yard. "How was work?" she asked, her tone casual but warm. "Good," I replied. "Productive." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our drinks and watching the world go by. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air between us felt lighter, less burdened by the weight of the past. "I'm proud of us," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence. I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "Why's that?" "Because we didn't give up," she said, her voice steady. "We could have, and no one would have blamed us. But we're still here. We're still trying." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Yeah, we are." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized something I hadn't been sure of for a long time. Grace and I weren't the same people we'd been when we got married, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. We were still learning, still growing, together. It wouldn't be perfect. It might never be. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.